A very good morning to one and all present here. I'm Adila Mohsin and I welcome you all to yet another lecture in our NET JRF lecture series, organized by the Eklavya Club of the Department of English, IEHE. As our resource person for today's lecture, I would like to welcome Dr. Saman Ashfaq ma'am. She is, since 2023, ma'am has been a very integral part of the Department of English of IEHE as an assistant professor and one of our most, I should say, beloved professors in the department. And ma'am completed her graduation from the Delhi University, and she completed her MPhil and PhD from Jamia Millia Islamia, Delhi. She has published various papers in national as well as international journals. We welcome you, ma'am. Ma'am also cleared her NET JRF. I'm so sorry, her NET with JRF. So we are glad to have you, ma'am, and I welcome you to the lecture.
Okay, now I don't really have a PPT to share because I just kind of opted for these lectures quite late. So I'll be sharing it with you very soon in the near future. But this is going to be a very brief introduction to Australian literature. I'd like to begin by talking about what actually is the difference between British literature and American literature and Australian literature and Canadian literature. I mean, all of them are writing in English. I mean, we understand that it's a language which is spoken by almost all the European, basically the Western countries. So how is the literature different? Can anyone just tell me about what difference lies between these so-called Australian and Canadian and Nigerian and African literatures? Of course, they are post-colonial nations, especially when we look at the African scenario. But when we look at Australia, Canada, Britain, what do you think is the underlying difference between these literatures?
Ma'am, what
would anyone? Yeah.
Ma'am,
okay, the culture and the some okay, yeah. Adila just somebody said the culture and the environment. Okay. Anybody else? Adila, you were saying something?
Yes, ma'am. I think one of the major themes would be the basic themes of the literature, because every country has their own history, so their literature would be influenced by their respective history.
Yes, both of you are right, because literature, as we see it, always is a product of not only of simply of somebody's mind. It's not simply a creative output. It is a product of social, political, economic, as well as psychological influences. So the literature of any place is a product of its country, of its national identity. Now, for the NetJRF series, because you have questions from other literatures as well, the significance of Australian literature lies in the fact that you have a land which was, of course, colonized by the Britishers. It was a settler colony. It also had a reputation for being a penal colony or a convict's land. So you have a lot of significance attached to that kind of an identity. It comes from the land of sin, the land of being of the tainted people who were not really required in Britain were sent away on very harsh punishments to Australia. So Australia had that kind of an identity or a kind of a reputation, at least in Britain. It was seen as a far off, deserted, and a difficult land to live in. So Australian literature, if you look at the beginnings of Australian literature in English, they began soon after the settlement of the country by Europeans. You also have Aboriginal writings, native culture, the native people who were writing there, living there. So there is an oral history and also a literary history attached to Australia from the very beginning. Not only that, if you look at the imagining of Australia in British literature, I don't know if you all remember, but in Gulliver's Travels, in book 4, where Gulliver visits the land of the Houyhnhnms, if you remember, the place that is referred to is somewhere near Tasmania. And Tasmania, of course, is a part of Australia. So you understand that you have British writers imagining Australia as a land, a far off land, which is segregated, which is secluded, and which is a place which is basically a dumping ground for all that is undesirable in Britain. So if you look at the common themes, especially in the beginning of Australian literature, they include indigenous and, the conflict between indigenous culture and settler identity, you have alienation, you have the sense of exile which these people have been suffering from, and of course the relationship to place, to geography, because Australia had this reputation, or rather, you must have heard of the country of the bush, if you're familiar with this term, bush literature also. A lot of literature is dedicated to defining and describing the hardships faced by the people living in the land, especially the climate, and of course the hardships faced by people in trying to set up a new land. When we look at the early works of Australian literature, they tended to be talking about tales of bravery, tales of settling into a new place, tales of daring and adventure, which was about exploring the new frontier of Australian outback. And they were also known as the ripping yarn variety. Ripping yarn, Ripping, ripping, and WYARN yarn. Ripping yarn variety kind of a literature means a literature which tells a long tale of adventure, of success, of hardship, of male camaraderie. You also have Australian literature being labeled as sometimes talking about the idea of mateship, or rather the idea of friendship that existed between men when they set up a new land. So this male camaraderie that we talk about is also a part of Australian experience. So in the earliest part of Australian writing, you find writers such as Rolf Boldrewood. This is ROLF, Rolf, BOLDREWOOD, Rolf Boldrewood. You have Marcus Clarke, MARCUSCLARKE, and you have Joseph Furney, FURNEY. They embodied these ideas, in these ideals of bravery, adventure in their tales, and they also at the same time try to occupy, or rather try to capture through their writings, the vernacular language which was being used by the common Australian man. Because you understand, if you look at how would you define Australian culture? Australian culture was a mix of the native culture. It was a mix of the settler people, the Europeans who were settling down. It was also about the convicts serving in the penal colony. So you had a variety of people living there, and a kind of a common a vernacular culture emerged, which these writers make an effort to convey to the reader. Now, these novelists, the three novelists that we're talking about right now, Rolf Boldrewood, Marcus Clarke, and Joseph Furney, they also gave valuable insights into penal colonies, and they also spoke about how the early rural settlements, which the first generation of settlers made an effort to build in these lands, was basically how Australia came into existence, or Australia came into being. So you have basically the first wave of Australian writing focuses on the idea of building a land, of establishing a rural colony, because remember, land was difficult to live in. Agriculture was again a major or a common form of occupation, and people found it very difficult to cultivate the land. So the effort that these people had put in as the first generation settlers, all of these are conveyed through the experiences spoken about by these writers, Boldrewood, Clarke, and Furney. The first novel which was written and which has been recorded to be written in Australian literature is titled Quintus Servington, Quintus, Quintus Servinton, Quintus Servington, and there's a subtitle to it: A Tale Founded Upon Incidents of Real Occurrence, published and written in Tasmania. A Tale Founded Upon Incidents of Real Occurrence, published and written in Tasmania. This was in the year 1831. And the author was surprisingly a convicted English forger known as Henry Savery, Savery. So the first novel has been written by somebody who was a convict in Australia. So this first novel again deals with the very familiar themes of establishing an identity, and the kind of isolation that these people faced from their own people who had been because they'd been sent away on punishments. The first novel written by a woman was in the year 1838, and it was known as The Guardian. The name of the novel was Guardian, and it was a tale by Anna Maria. Anna Maria Bunn, that is Bunn. Anna Maria Bunn. This was a Gothic romance, and this was the first novel to be ever written in the history of Australian literature by a woman, published in the year 1838. You will find that women writers make a presence in Australian literature much later. Because if you look at English literature, you find you find Jane Austen, you find writers, and you find poets before that also. But in Australian literature, because of the kind of male camaraderie that we talk about, a lot of emphasis was laid on male friendship. About male bonding rather than women. Women stayed at the in the background. They stayed in the sidelines for a very very long time. So, but the first novel by a man and the first novel by a woman were roughly published in the year 1831 and 1838. Okay, now if you look at poetry, you have a poet known as Adam Lindsay Gordon. This is Adam ADAMLINDSAY Lindsay Gordon, who is known as the national poet of Australia. And along with another poet known as Christopher Brennan, they are regarded as the greatest Australian poets of all time. Both Gordon and Brennan's works, they conform to traditional styles of poetry. You find that like the literature of every country, which had been settled out of Britain, you find that a lot of influence of Wordsworth and Coleridge and the movements that happened in Britain can be found on these literatures as well. So in the early 19th century, you will find that the literatures of the neoclassical age would do find a place, or the style of writing does find a place in Australian style of writing. So you have classical allusions. You have basically their poetry belonged to the domain of high culture, because they were trying to follow the ideals of the neoclassical age. At the same time, you also have Gordon and Brennan's work. Not only, I mean, they were able to, I would say, synchronize or fuse two distinct aspects of literature. One would be the local native culture, which comprised of folk songs and ballads and Aboriginal and indigenous literature, and at the same time you find the classical allusions to Greek and Roman culture, which was something which they followed from the British tradition. So both of these poets were extremely successful because they were seen as the founding pillars of Australian poetry, because they were able to appeal to the identity and they were able to appeal to the masses in Australia because of the style and the ability to merge their experiences with that of the local experience. Apart from that, you have two other poets who have based their writings basically on ballads and the local culture. Henry Lawson and Banjo Patterson. I don't know if you've heard of this work known as Waltzing Matilda. Has anyone heard of this work? Waltzing, WALTZING, Waltzing Matilda. This is a very famous Australian verse written by Banjo Patterson, and it's almost like a ballad, and it's a very popular work in the history of Australian literature, because it is written, the way we had Robin Hood ballads and the ballads in the early 15th and 14th century in England. You have ballads of a similar kind, but of course located in the local culture, which were taken up by Banjo Patterson. So Henry Lawson and Banjo Patterson were the chief exponents of popular ballads, and Waltzing Matilda is one of the most important work which occupies a very high place in the history of Australian literature because of its appeal to local culture. Now, if you look at the early 19th century literature, you will find that there are very romanticized images which are painted of Australian land. It was seen as the land of adventure, the outback, the frontier land, and rugged characters. It's very similar to American Western movies. If you all see the American literature, and you have this the kind of literature or the kind of cinema which talks about American ranches and people living there and outlaws, basically the gun culture. You find a reflection of that in the Australian literature also. And these romanticized versions of the rugged characters and the land, they were extremely they played an extremely important role in shaping the nation's psyche. So you have a great pride that people took in their land, because this was the land which they were actually forging with their hands. So in spite of the kind of an image that Australia had in the eyes of the world, especially in the Western world, that it was a useless land, it was a land of the convicts, it was a penal colony, it was meant to be a punishment. You find that the people who were actually living there were gradually working very hard. At least the literary writers were trying to create a conscious image of themselves as a hardworking and and a set of people taking a lot of pride in their national identity. So you find that by the time we come, so you can say that Australian literature, it starts quite late. It starts, let's say, in the 1830s and 1820s. Before that, you had the Aboriginal and the oral literature, which was being taken care of by the native cultures. So by the time we come to the 20th century, we see that a lot of poets, especially if you look at the prominent poets, I'll just mention a few names. A.D. Hope. This is Alec Derwent Hope. He's a very prominent poet of the 20th century Australian literature. His first collection, known as Wandering Islands, was published in the year 1955. It is a very savage, it's a very savage and a very satirical portrait of written on the Australian public, and he is influenced by Pope and a lot of Augustan poets, and also by Auden and Yeats. So you can understand, for somebody who's writing in 1955 to still be influenced or to still imitate writers like Pope and the Augustan poets like Dryden and Swift, you find that the literary influences of Britain were seeping in quite late in the Australian land. He also wrote a very interesting reply to Andrew Marvell's poem to his coy mistress, and it's a very, again, a very satirical and a very savage piece. Most of his poems have been seen as highly erotic, and but he is a very important poet of the 20th century. His writings have been, has been seen as as laying a foundation for very important an important setting of Australian poetry. You also have Judith Wright. You must have heard of Judith Wright, again a female poet. You find her writing in the year from 1915 to 2000. So again, a very late entrant into the Australian scene, but she was also the first Australian poet to receive Queen's Gold Medal for poetry. And most of her works are, they focus on Australian environment, relationship between settlers, indigenous Australian land, and the bush, among the other themes. You have the limitations of language and the existential crisis that a lot of people and a lot of people faced in the Australian land. The Moving Image is the title of the first collection that was published by Judith Wright. Right, but that's one thing. Then you have Gwen Harwood, Gwen, Gwen Harwood, another poet, and she focuses on themes of motherhood and stifled roles. So you all, by the time we come to the 20th century, apart from the traditional male writing, you find women creating a space for themselves, especially Judith Wright and Gwen Harwood. And the focus of their writings are basically the stifled roles which have been assigned to women, especially young mother. The music is another important motif which we find reflected in women's writings, and you find that the landscape, about the surprisingly, a lot of poets also talk about the idea of dispossession. By dispossession, I'm talking about how did the Aboriginal and the native writers feel with the coming in of the European settlers, with the coming in of British settler colonies. So you find a lot of Aboriginal. We'll looking into them a little later. But you find that even in the European writings, you find that there is a sense of dispossession that they're acutely aware of, that they have actually taken over somebody's. So you find this guilt of taking over somebody's land also reflected in some of the writings. Kenneth Slessor is another poet, important poet. Are you able to follow? Any doubts anybody has so far? Anybody? Sonal, who is Ramisha? I am not aware. Are you all from first year, second year students also?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, Nuria. Okay, Nuria is there. Okay, Adila. So, are you able to follow, or should I simplify it further?
No, ma'am, we are following. It's
You're able to
clear.
follow?
Yes, ma'am,
It's
it's
clear?
clear. Yes,
Okay,
ma'am.
because I'm keeping it a little simpler because I don't think most of you are from first and second years also as well. So I'm trying to keep it as simple as possible. Just try to. So Kenneth Slessor is another poet. He is again seen as a modern. You find a lot of modernist influences in Australian in his poetry, and I'll not really give you the names of all the books that he's written because Beach Burial is one of the most important collection of poems that he actually wrote, which is a tribute to World War II troops, Australian troops which fought along with Britain. So you have Beach Burial is an important collection. You have Five Bells by him. Then you have Earth Visitors and so on and so forth. You have a lot of poets like Leslie Murray, John Forbes, John Tranter. You find them experimenting with contemporary styles of writing. You find them experimenting with urban myths, and you find them experimenting with existentialism and absurd theater of the absurd and so on and so forth. So you have a lot of poets like Kenneth Slessor, Leslie Murray, John Forbes, John Tranter, and you have Judith Beveridge, a lot of other poets who have been writing in the 20th century. Now, most of these poets, they focus on, or most of the Australian writers focus on the complicated relationship between land and writing. Yeah, as I began my lecture, I pointed out as to how, for example, every land has its distinct culture, and that culture is reflected through the literature of that land. So the relationship that you have with the land is also reflected in the writings. The landscape of Australia, that is it's seen as both. It is seen as threatening and alienating because it's a difficult place to live in, but it is also seen as something which is vibrantly alive. So you have, be they short stories, be the poems, or be the novels, you have a very distinct, motive of land and people being connected with each other. I don't know if you all have read any novel by Patrick White, but I think those of you who want to do a master's will probably come across Patrick White. Patrick White he won the Nobel Prize in 1973, and if you read his novels, you find that you find a great description of land, and a description which is very different from what we find in British literature so far. It's a very complicated relationship that writers and characters have with the land in which they're living. Again, you also find, so you have you have short stories by Barbara Paynton, for that matter, Kenneth Cook. I'll share a PPT soon so that you're able to get these names right there. But identity is another issue which kind of is a, I would say, which lies at the forefront in all Australian literature. This issue has been dealt with writers like Miles Franklin. She usually talks about feminist issues, and you have Patrick White, Andrew McGaw, Christos, Helen Garner. All of these, a lot of writers of the 20th century, they focus on the idea of identity and their troubled relationship with the land of origin. Remember, Australia was a land of the Commonwealth. It became a part of the British Commonwealth, when it became when it was formally announced as a colony. So you find that there are feelings of attraction, but there are also feelings of revulsion that the Australian people had towards Britain. For some reason, they felt that they had been ostracized and isolated, but for another reason, they took a lot of pride that they were building a new land. So all of these feelings, these dual feelings of love and hate, these dual feelings of attraction and revulsion can be found through these writings. So you'll find that a lot of poets, a lot of writers, novelists, all of them, there is a running theme of land, and land almost emerges as a character in most of these writings. Now, apart from this settler, all of these people that I've been talking about right now were basically Britishers, or rather you can call them settlers. But you also had a strand of Aboriginal writings. By Aboriginal writing, again, I mean writing by the natives, the native tribes and the native Aboriginal cultures, their poets and their novelists writing in their own language and also writing in English, because the influence of English, because English education started with the with the settlement of the Britishers in Australia. So you must have heard of Jack Davis. Jack Davis is a playwright. He is an Aboriginal writer. You have Mudruru, Mudroroo. He's again an Aboriginal writer. You have a lot of poets, Sally Morgan, Alexis Wright, and Tara June Finch. All of these writers were based in Aboriginal writing. Also focuses on the the forces of colonialism, the forces of globalization, and the impact that this occupying culture has on the native culture or the vernacular language of the Aborigines. If you read the history of American literature, for that matter, you find that gradually, as American literature flourished, you found that native culture and native vernacular literature, it was completely sidelined. Similarly, in Australia also, even though they had a very vibrant Aboriginal culture, as Australian identity became, or rather, as the idea of as settlers basically settled in Australia in large numbers, you find that the Aboriginal and the native writings taking a back seat, or rather being marginalized, in the face of what is known as Commonwealth literature. So you find that most of these writings, you have the effect of world wars, you have modernizing influences of British and American literary movements. All of these have a place in Australian writing. You also have something known as, if you look at the literature of Australia post 1990s, you have something known as grunge literature. Grunge, grunge literature. What do you mean by the word grunge? Can anyone tell me? Grunge. Anyone heard of this word, grunge?
No, ma'am.
No? Okay. Grunge literature, basically, grunge is a term which comes out of music. You must have heard of grunge pop. It's an amalgamation of different styles of, music being brought together. Now, contemporary in the literature of Australia post 1990s, you have something known as grunge literature making a place for itself. This is nothing but fictional and semi-autobiographical works, or rather novels, which focus on the youth. Dissatisfied, disenfranchised youth, young people who have no jobs, young people who are experimenting with drugs and basically experimenting with sex and experimenting with different styles of living. It's very similar to, if you remember, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, the angry young man literature, or the angry young man drama in the American literature. You must have heard of this phrase, at least the third years, angry young man. No? Okay, never mind. So you have contemporary Australian literature. There is a new crop of very new young age writers who are focusing on their experiences. They're showing their disillusionment with land, with money, with relationships, with the inability to find jobs. So these are these are people who are dissatisfied with their land and its people. So no longer do they take a lot of pride. This is the new wave of writing which is now seen in Australian literature. Of course, it doesn't dominate the entire Australian literature, but you have a kind of a shift of where the newer generation is finding itself frustrated with the land. So you have a very important work of this kind has been is the novel known as The River Ophelia. The River Ophelia is a novel by Justine Etler, Justine and Ettler, and she the usual focus of this novel is on the experiences of the youth, right? You also have post-grunge literature, which is from 1998 to 2010. Again, you find that these continues the very same experiences of disillusionment and frustration of the coming of age people. So the writers are very young, 23, 24. They're basing the novels have been written based on their own experiences, based on their inability to merge with the ideals of the land and so on and so forth. So there is a kind of a identity crisis amongst the newer generations of Australian writers. You find that apart from that, you have writers like David Malouf. David Malouf won a Booker Prize for a very important work known as Remembering Babylon. If you are familiar with this work, Remembering Babylon, in 1993. You find him winning a Booker Prize. He's a novelist and a short story writer. You have Patrick White. You have David Malouf. Apart from David Malouf, Patrick White remains one of the most shining figures of Australian literature. Apart from this, you also now when you come to the contemporary, as we're discussing, since this Australian literature came into existence quite late. What exactly would be the other issues that you think would dominate Australian writing?
Ma'am, large scale migration.
Large scale migration would be large scale migration? You're talking about large scale migration in today's times or in the earlier times when Australia was being established? Yes, large scale migration did have a very I would say powerful impact on the psyche of the Australian literature. But which period are you basing it into? If you talk about contemporary Australian literature, migration out of Australia or migration into Australia?
Ma'am, from ancient period I'm talking about.
Okay, you're talking about not let's call it the early phases of settlement. Okay, now
Yes,
do you
ma'am.
think do you think migration in contemporary period also can be a theme or rather an issue in almost all these lands? Because looking at the immigration policies, we've seen now what Donald Trump is about to do, right? Canada also has a very large population from Asian countries. Like in fact, almost 10 lakh Sikhs are living in Canada. Similarly, in Australia also you find a lot of people from other countries, from other continents, especially Asia and Africa, living in Australia. So post 9/11, post the crashing of the bombing of the World Trade Towers, you find that a lot of there is a sentiment of xenophobia also that you find in these writings. Now, post 2001, post 9/11, you find that now increasingly Australian people in general are becoming a little suspicious of outsiders. And you find that reflected in the attacks, you find that reflected in racism, the growing influence, the growing white, you would probably call them white supremacist leadership almost all over the world. So that's a large scale migration, not only into Australia from Europe, but also migration from other places. For example, from the other parts of the world, third world nations, if we may use that word, from let's say India and Africa and so many other places. So you find that there is there's a tension which is existing between there is a rush for resources. And that's why when you look at grunge literature is also in so many ways a reaction. The younger people are fighting against the fact that their jobs have been taken away by the immigrants. So this constant stress between the settlers and the immigrants and the aborigines and so on and so forth, that is becoming a more prominent motif which is being found in contemporary writings of Australian literature. Apart from that, right from the very beginning to this very day, you find there is a kind of a conflict or a torn affiliation between that of a mother nation and an adopted land. Who is the mother nation for Australia? Who would we call the mother nation? Anybody? The mother country for Australia. Which country is the mother country? Just give any answer. It's perfectly fine. I think it will be better if you all respond. It will make a class more interesting. Yes.
Ma'am, I don't know actually.
Mother nation would be Britain. Remember, people who settled, they actually came from Britain.
Okay, ma'am.
Yeah, mother country for Canada, for Australia, for a lot of Commonwealth nations, you will find that the mother country would always be Britain. You understand? That's why, because the original people who settled in Australia were sent as either as convicts or as settlers they came from Britain only. You understand? So mother country is Britain. You know, they were a colony of the Britishers for a very long time. Australia, as I said, it was a part of the British Commonwealth. You understand? So it was much later that countries like Canada became sovereign, and countries like Australia also became sovereign. So you understand? So you have the affiliation. So who do I mean love? Do I love Britain or do I love Australia? This was a major source of conflict in the people living in Australia, because they were torn between their people, their customs and culture back home, and what they were living with in Australia in the present land. So adopted land is Australia because they settled in the new land, but the mother country was Britain because they came essentially from there. Is it clear now? Any other doubts? Harshita, any doubt? Okay. So what I'm trying to tell you is, even American literature, where did people, if you look at the beginnings of America, have you had any lecture on other literature so far? American, Canadian? I haven't
Yes,
been able to
ma'am.
keep. Okay.
Um,
You had a lecture on American literature?
yes, ma'am. American also, and if I'm not wrong, African also.
Okay, so you've had an American and African. So you find that in American literature also, the people who settled, the earliest settlers in America were from Britain.
Yes,
You
ma'am.
understand? Right? It was only later on that they came to adopt a very independent identity for themselves. Similar has been the case with Canada and Australia also. Remember, when we were talking about convicts being sent as punishment, who was sending? Britain was sending its convicts. Right? Britain was sending its people who were not needed, people who were hardcore criminals, people who were murderers, people who were, who they thought would bring a bad name to their country. They were all transported to Australia. And these people, they were sent and living in jails there. They were working, they were making the roads, they were building hospitals. So these were the people. That's why the first novel has been written by an English convict, because these were the first people to settle, the first British people to settle in Australia were the convicts. Is it clear now? Okay, shall we proceed?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I don't know if you all have read a novel by Jane Austen known as Mansfield Park. Has anyone heard of its name? At least, if not read the novel?
Ma'am, could you please repeat? I wasn't able to hear.
Mansfield Park, a novel by Jane Austen.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So Srijan has heard. Okay, so yeah, you have heard of this name. Now, if you have read the novel, you will find that there was if I don't know how many of you all have read the novel. Just raise your hand. If you have read, it's fine. Otherwise, I'll just tell you very briefly how Australia pictures in that novel. Anybody? Okay, so no raised hands. So I'm assuming nobody has read. Anyway, any other novel by Jane Austen which first year and second year students have read so far? Fatma, any novel? Nobody? Okay, Pride and Prejudice. Okay, I was expecting that answer. Okay. Emma. Okay, good. Okay, so let me now, if you're familiar with, so you have in Mansfield Park, there is a girl who she's one of the daughters of a very rich man, and she is married to a man, but she has an affair outside her marriage with another man. So because this brings a lot of disrepute to the family, she and her aunt are transported to Australia. And it is said at the end of the novel that she and her aunt would pass their remaining days in the outback. So outback obviously refers to Australia. So what I'm trying to draw attention to is, how did the Britishers imagine Australia? Britishers imagined Australia as a place where all the unwanted people could go and spend the rest of their days. It had that reputation. It had that kind of a taint, the land of the sinners. So even in Jane Austen, you find that a woman and her aunt are being they're sent by a ship because she's an adulterous woman. It comes out in the open. Everyone knows about it. So as a punishment, she's ostracized from civil society, from genteel British society, and she's sent away to live in Australia. What I'm trying to draw attention to is the kind of a place that Australia was imagined by Britishers. So that's why, so there are, when we talk about torn affiliations, the sense of conflict people have towards their motherland, which was Britain, and towards the land of adoption, which was Australia. And Australia also comes with its own reputation. Okay. Now, then you have another, another major conflict would be the conflict between the settlers and the aboriginals. Now, there is, when you come and occupy a new land, you're taking away from somebody who is actually living there. So indigenous cultures and indigenous people were being marginalized in an attempt to take control over a new land by new people. So that conflict is also evident. 20th century literature of Australia still grapples with these issues. This is what I'm trying to point out. And apart from that, the land itself is almost in no other literature, not even in African literature, would you find this association of the land looming large or existing almost like a character in all the works of Australian literature, be it poetry, be it short stories, be it fiction, be it travel writing, be it the histories of the place, because it has a very distinct, not only in terms of climate or not only in terms of land, bush culture. The word bush is being used. You must have heard bush inhabitants. You'll hear this word constantly about Australia. But it was essentially pictured as an hostile land where survival conditions were very difficult. The seasons were very different from the British seasons, the weather conditions. All of these are a recurring motif right from the earliest literature to you find them reflected in Patrick White, the very contemporary authors of Australian literature. So if you look at the last 2 centuries, if you look at the beginnings of Australian literature from the 1830s onwards to contemporary Australian literature, of course, is dominated by the same themes and same issues which govern other cultures and nations. For example, immigration, racism, white supremacy, marginalization of indigenous culture, the feminist anxiety. For example, feminist authors, for a long time, female authors did not find a place in the history of Australian literature, the conflict between identity and land, and so on and so forth. So all of these things are being reflected here. Now, one more thing that I want to talk about here is where am I? So, if I want to sum up, if I want to talk about the distinct writing tradition of Australian literature, what would it be? You would find one would be dominated by Aboriginal or native writings. The other would be dominated by literature which takes a lot of pride in Australian identity. It talks about nation building. It talks about national integration. It talks about building a national ethos. And the third kind of writing would be a writing which is conflicted between emotions for the motherland, which was Britain, and emotions for the adopted land. Now, the third kind of writing is basically not sure about itself. It is not really sure about its place in Australian literature, because they bring to the fore, or they underscore the anxieties of the people who are living in. Even in the current generation, you find people suffering from this kind of a complex where they don't know where to belong. So both oral and literary traditions exist in Australian writing. You find that this part of this existence of oral and tradition is very similar to what existed in Africa. Also, Africa also had a very rich oral tradition of writing. Of course, American literature also, the Red Indian culture, if you talk about it. But then in Australia, you find that, and it is reflected in the writings of not only British, or rather the settler authors. By settler authors, I mean the people who had settled in Australia from Britain. So they are known as settlers. And indigenous people are the tribal people who have been living in Australia originally, who said that this land belonged to us. The settlers came in from outside. They came from Britain, either as convicts, either as policemen, either as law and order forces. And then they gradually settled down here, built a new land, built a new nation, and then the literature, of course, it's a very young literature in that sense of the word. You will not really find it going back into thousands or hundreds or 500s of years. Of course, indigenous literature does have its place, but you will find that indigenous literature in English is more important, or rather finds is more I would say available easily, rather than the literature written by aborigines in their own language. Okay, anything else you want to ask? Would this be enough? I've given for, I've only tried to give you the names of very important, for example, the first novel to be ever written by a man, the first novel to be ever printed in Australia by a woman. I've given these important things because they should stick. This is something that you should really know. Waltzing Matilda by Banjo Patterson, a very important work. This is a question which I think does come up sometimes. Then you have important poets, Patrick White and David Malouf. If you're preparing for NET, you should know everything about Judith Wright. You should know almost everything about David Malouf and Patrick White and all their works. You should be familiar with all their works, right? So you have a lot of Booker Prize winners. Thomas Keneally also won. He wrote this work known as Schindler's Ark. Schindler's Ark. If you all are familiar with the American movie Schindler's List, has anyone
Yes,
seen the
ma'am.
film? Yes, it is based on the Holocaust, right? The Jewish Holocaust. So the original novel was written by Thomas Keneally. That is Keneally. He wrote the original work known as Schindler's Ark. Then from there it was adopted into Schindler's List by I think it was who made the film. I forgot the name of the filmmaker, but it talks about the Jewish Holocaust and how a person actually makes a list of all the World War II criminals and tries to hunt them down. So this is another Booker Prize winning work. Apart from that, anything else you want to ask? You can have last 10 minutes for discussion or something if you really want to clarify something. This was just, I didn't have much time to prepare. I just kind of picked up my notes and.
Okay. So, ma'am, can we conclude now?
Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone, for taking time out, huh?
Ma'am, I would
Amidst
like
the
to.
vacations.
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, thank you so much, because it was only because of you that we were able to, host this lecture properly
Okay.
and familiarize ourselves with Australian literature. It was very new for me personally, and I believe most of the others also.
Okay.
So
Thank
I
you
would
so
now
much.
like, ma'am, may I please invite Nooria for the vote of thanks?
Oh my God, you have a vote of thanks also. My God.
Yes.
You're doing it very formally. My God.
A very warm good afternoon to one and all present here. Respected ma'am, I, Nooria Siddiqui, on the behalf of all the students, want to say thank you for your wonderful session on Australian literature. You explained everything so clearly and made it easy for us to understand this important topic. Your way of connecting history, authors, and literary movements really helped us to learn better. We are grateful for your patience and the way you answered all our questions. Your love for literature is truly inspiring. Thank you, ma'am, for guiding us and sharing your knowledge.
Okay. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.